You are listening to the Smart Betting Club podcast with me, your host, Peter Ling. Now, this podcast is sponsored by the Matchbook Betting Exchange, and you can find out more on what they offer smart bettors over at matchbook.com. And if you are interested in learning more what it takes to make a profit betting, please do check out my service for winning bettors over at smartbettingclub.com. Hello and welcome to episode 89 of the Smart Betting Club podcast. Well, from starting out behind the counter at Ladbrokes to leading the British Horseracing Authority and advising the UK Gambling Commission, Nick Rust, my guest today, has seen it all. So in today's episode, I'm going to be exploring Nick's unique journey through the heart of the betting industry, the battles between regulation and reality, and what the future holds for punters, racing and bookmakers alike. We're also going to touch on Nick's SBC membership, which is how our paths first crossed. Nick, it's great to have you on. Thanks for making the time for the show. How are you doing?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to this. I hope I don't bore everyone, but I'll try and give insights from my time and experience.
Well, yeah, you have lots of unique insight, and it goes all the way back to, I believe you started out at Ladbrokes as a shop cashier back in 1987. I'd be surprised how many of my guests actually started out in betting shops. It seems quite a common route. But I mean, I'm curious how it all began for you in terms of that early betting interest and that initial role. And from there, did you ever expect that you'd be ending up helping shape the UK gambling landscape?
No, never. I've always enjoyed betting. I used to go to arcades in the local town and played with 10p pieces when I was about 12 and shouldn't have been playing probably. And my dad took me off to Kelso Races when I was 14. The thought of going there left me full of dread, actually, because I only knew a couple of people who were interested in horse racing and they bored the backside off me, frankly. So my dad was dragging me along when I was 14 because I was due to be playing football and our match was called off and he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to hang around Woolworth Steps in Berwick-on-Tweed, with all the other yobbos." And he said, "No, you come to get some fresh air." He dragged me along to Kelso Races with a form bore who he worked with. But I got there and I saw the bookies' boards and all the numbers. And suddenly the sky seemed coloured, the smells and the sounds all came to life. And I became very interested in what this betting and racing thing was. So I suppose it started from there. I bunked off school a few times, to be honest, when the Cheltenham Festival was on and slipped off my school uniform jacket and dodged into Ladbrokes in Berwick and put a few bets on when I was 15 and 16. I'd inherited a little bequeathment from the passing of my grandfather. Couple of £100, and I managed to do all that in about 2 weeks, I think, and thought there must be a better way. And as many people do at school, I suppose they start their own little businesses, and I started a little betting business up when I was 16 and eventually got the money back. But it did result in me being suspended from school for 2 weeks when I got caught offering roulette in the common room on a wet day. But I suppose that's the background to me getting involved in and interested in betting. And it stemmed very much from that trip to the races, really, for the first time when I was 14. I went off to college to do a degree in accountancy and economics when I was 18, and I had a summer job, which I pursued at Ladbrokes in Berwick. I worked as a board marker cashier there, so marking the boards, one of the last shops still to have a board, I think, back in those days. But that was great fun because you were out with the customers, having the banter, and I learned very quickly out there that customers will always try and take an advantage where they can, legitimately where they can. And so if they're busy putting you off listening to the shows of betting so that you haven't marked down 2-1 to 7-4 for the favourite, then that's all in their favour and off they go up to the counter and take the 2-1. So soon learned about that when I got reprimanded by the shop manager for not moving the prices quick enough on occasions. I probably spent too much time in London. I was studying in Ealing, going racing at the weekends to Newmarket and Windsor and Newbury and all sorts of places. And it was in the days where we were fortunate enough to have a student grant, which allowed you to get a bank account and meant you could borrow some money if you needed to. And there were a few of us who enjoyed going racing and raiding the quiz machines that were emerging at the time for a few extra quid to allow us to go racing and to keep the overdraft away, if you like.
Yeah.
So much so that I remember turning up for a year 2 exam in economics and accountancy and thinking, what am I doing here? This is a law exam and I haven't read the books, haven't been to the lessons, nothing. I'd flown through my first year without trying very hard, really. And I thought it was going to be as simple as that. And I was under a kind of delusion as I turned up for that exam. And it's the only time I've been in an exam where I literally turned the paper over and woke up, if you like, and walked out. So I got rightly kicked out of college because I hadn't been attending, I hadn't been cracking on. I resumed my summer job with Ladbrokes, and I thought, what am I going to do? I love it round here. And I started applying for a shop manager's job and got my career going with Ladbrokes after that. So that was that. And I just loved it. I loved working in the betting shops, loved the people that you worked with and the customers that you served. And, I suppose I was quite ambitious in my own little way. I wanted to really change things, and that resulted in, when I was doing my shop manager training, I actually ran a competition in the shop in Berwick where I was training, and I put an advert in the local paper as part of a promotion, totally unaware that at the time you weren't allowed to advertise betting premises. So I got a visit from the regional manager for Scotland, who was apparently dispatched quite quickly because Ladbrokes in Berwick was one of the best shops around, really, and had no competition at the time. And he interviewed me in the back of the shop and basically put to me that maybe I was a plant for William Hill trying to effect the loss of the license for Ladbrokes in Berwick. I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. It was
That's amazing.
Way above my head. But anyway, I think they were going to fire me, but someone saw something in me during the disciplinary hearing, and I got a final warning. I wasn't appointed as a shop manager. I was sent off to a shop in Edinburgh in Muirhouse, which, if you've ever read the book or watched the film Trainspotting, is where that was based in the early scenes of that film.
Yeah.
So, quite a tough area, lots of drugs. I learned all about sharp spins and so on, and how to clear needles and so on from the toilets. That was, quite a way of learning the realities of life aged 20. But, I had some rehabilitation there for 6 months. I was given a shop manager's job, and then, had a career in operations and regional management over the next 10 or 12 years before the dawning of the internet. So that's how I got going.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there about that growth of the internet. You were right at the point when it was started to flare up and it became such a big part of it. What was that early adoption era like? It must have been a really exciting time because you were at the start of something really big, which has obviously developed into what we have as modern betting these days.
I just moved to London to take on a regional manager's role, and 5 months afterwards, a number of senior management were all called in on New Year's Day in 1999 for a meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day, which was good fun in Rayners Lane. And Chris Bell briefed us that we were taking over Coral. That was the first time it was attempted. And I was put on a project as operational lead of the two businesses, to the integration of the two businesses. Now, the deal got referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, the forerunner of the current Competition Commission in the UK, and ultimately was rejected. But I worked on the operational integration and planning, and also the response to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, working with John O'Reilly, who's now the Chief Executive at Rank. He led it and I was supporting him. So I learned a heck of a lot about the industry. I thought I knew a lot, having worked in the shops, but I learned a lot about how it worked, how products were supplied, what the regulation was, and so on. And of course, it was around that time that the internet was taking off, really. There were lots of rogue casino operators, but the traditional land-based firms were starting to get active in it. And, Coral had made a good little start with their liaison with Eurobet at the time. And Ladbrokes really had been a bit resistant of it, had a trading team that was, worried about the fact that it was used to making 15, 16% out of everything and suddenly was going to have to compete at 6, 7% perhaps, at lower these days, of course.
Yeah.
But John O'Reilly came out the other side of that Monopolies and Mergers Commission inquiry and set about pushing forward with what became Ladbrokes eGaming, Ladbrokes.com. And I was involved in that from the early stages after the tax issue where bookmakers were, going offshore to take advantage of the tax saving and the ability to offer internet products into the UK. Once that had been resolved, we were based out of Rayners Lane in West London and really kicking on with the internet. I would say it was very Heath Robinson. The first bets that we were taking were, in effect, being printed out on bits of paper to settle and be manually put back into the system. That's how rudimentary it was at the time. There were clearly some new customers coming on who weren't familiar with betting too much and were, high value customers to Ladbrokes because they were just having fun, being very recreational. The sort of customers that SkyBet pursued in later years when I was there, and subsequently, of course, as well. But also we were seeing lots of shrewdies around as well.
yeah, for sure.
And we were learning a lot about how to set markets up and how not to set markets up. But frankly, around that time, around 2000 to 2002, it was all about building a sports book using, proprietary software, working with external software developers and systems developers, but building our own software, building our own feeds, and adding products where we could. John O'Reilly, who I mentioned before, was, very, very early in on the online poker opportunity. And whilst he and I were working on other things, he really focused on that and delivered a deal for Ladbrokes Poker, which, was a tremendous success, took off. It was just amazing to sit there in the head office and just look at the amount of people that were live and playing that within the first few months of us going live with it. And we realized that we had this rare thing, a risk-free, well, in many respects, a risk-free product that could be offered alongside betting, which of course is not risk-free for a bookmaker or anyone involved. So it was just tremendous times. And, there were lots of people who had some experience in betting, some experience in early digital skills. I remember a day sort of early in 2002 when it was announced that we were appointing a webmaster. My goodness, what's a webmaster?
A webmaster.
That sounds like a wizard. What wouldn't they know and what don't we know? And in came a couple of people to help, effectively optimize search engines and start the work of tagging websites, all the stuff that is, meat and drink for people like you, Pete, and others these days, which, was like a new science back then. So it was very exciting. We were undertaking all sorts of sponsorships as well, trying to develop our business around the world. And so suddenly, you had, rather than just having high-rolling UK sport-facing telephone betting customers that were being traded out of Gibraltar as pretty much our only international business, suddenly we were in 30 or 40 countries fairly quickly, some grey market, trying to develop the business. And you were seeing all sorts of requests from local representatives saying, look, you've really got to get Asian handicaps on your site because we need this in Thailand, we need this in the Philippines, we need this in Malaysia. This is the betting they understand and you haven't got it. So I remember going off, I was dispatched by Chris Bell and the chief executive at the time, and John O'Reilly informed me that I would be going to Las Vegas in early 2001, and I would be going there taking the head of trading with me because he needed babysitting, was the way it was put to me. And why were we going to Vegas? I mean, this sounded like a holiday to me. I'd always wanted to go. And the task was really to go and meet and visit all of the land-based sports books and sportsbook operations, telephone sportsbook operations based in Vegas, and to get an understanding of the US product. It seems silly now. Everyone's offering it. It's very well established. But, we just didn't have it, and the trading director at Ladbrokes was, as I say, worrying about, well, why do we want to offer anything like that? We're busy making 17% out of horses. Why do we want to offer a product that only delivers 6%, 5%, 3%? And it was my task to help ensure that we got the most out of the meetings out there. And, he did a good job. And we started to develop US sports betting, and various other forms of betting followed after that. So it was a real exciting time of learning, and Ladbrokes learned through its pocket as well. Just as well we had poker and casino, because online it was pretty tough for us at that time to make any money at all. There were people who were much, much sharper than Ladbrokes at that time in the digital space.
I was thinking back then, now 2005, 2006 is when I really started to bet, especially on horse racing. I remember betting extensively with Ladbrokes. I think it was quite a rudimentary online kind of ability, platform. But at the time, Ladbrokes, quite easily to beat, let's say, back then, even with how strong reputation the trading team had at the time, the Magic Sign, very well respected, but still, it was a really interesting time. And you mentioned there about Asian handicaps. I remember, is it Premier Bet? They were doing that, Tony Bloom and his outfit and leading that. And I remember thinking, what is an Asian handicap? And it was exciting times because you were learning all the time, all these strange terms and terminologies and different sports and markets. And what we take for granted now, and you were obviously at the cut and thrust of that. And then obviously you mentioned there you worked through SkyBet, Coral, Ladbrokes, lots of senior roles. I'm curious, how did things evolve over time as things developed and we became to this mature market we have now? I'm interested in your approach there.
Just to reflect on what you said about Ladbrokes, the magic sign and so on. And in a world where you could control the supply or be heavily involved in controlling the supply of betting, and when there are restricted channels to market and restricted time windows, having the knowledge, and where horse racing was the dominant product before the internet got going, having that very good knowledge of what's going on at the senior level in the racing industry and making sure that you could put that to good use in your pricing was king, and Ladbrokes was very good at that. But things changed with the internet, and that control. It wasn't a case of all the bookmakers wouldn't offer prices until 10 o'clock in the morning. It was 24 hours.
Yeah.
People were pricing up races the day before. Extra place terms came. All sorts of offers came along. And suddenly, that control that Ladbrokes had wasn't there anymore. And it took quite a while for the organisation to adapt, as reflected perhaps by your own comments and experiences back in the early 2000s. One of the main things I saw happen and was part of was that instead of thinking that as an operator you needed to have a room full of odds compilers and risk managers and do it all yourself in-house, a number of dynamics changed things. The introduction of Betfair and subsequently other exchanges completely changed the dynamics of what consumers were able to know and understand. Firstly, because there was a transparency with Betfair, perhaps more than it has these days. A transparency available from Betfair, which allowed people to have very useful feeds of information about price movements, weight of money, even location of where some of that money came from, timing of that money, and so on. With their own ability, of course, to, for the first time, instead of having to try and dutch a series of horses to win and overcome an inherent margin and previously some tax, to be able to lay a horse, suddenly you could do it directly and off you went. And that dynamic really changed things, I think. Your service talks about price chasing feeds from time to time. And, the forerunners of those were born back at the time when Betfair got going. And suddenly we had some far better informed consumers, not just a series of geeks, niche people who found a way, but this was much more open and accessible to other people. So suddenly there was this concept of what had been called a betting market in the UK. Yes, it was a betting market, but it wasn't a very dynamic betting market. And suddenly you had the dynamics of a betting market emerging, partly because of the impact of Betfair and partly because the digital space had created such competitive dynamics. And I think that organizations like Ladbrokes and Coral and SkyBet realized that we weren't going to be able to do this ourselves. You can't odds compile your way through all of this. The power of the market and the power of money and the instantaneity of betting decisions and activities and the fact that everyone is open 24/7 means you're going to have to change the way that you approach things. Ladbrokes and others used to think about customers as to whether they could, to use terrible language, beat them or not. And that became more sophisticated and nuanced as time went on, because you were able to start saying that in a more effective way, you could restrict or manage or encourage customers by product type, by event type, and so on as well. And that whole new way of thinking about things emerged really in the 2000 to 2010. And obviously we see that in evidence today. So if I reflect on my time, I mentioned some of the time at Ladbrokes was about building out product outside of betting. And when I went to SkyBet in 2002, it was Surrey Sports still at the time. I was asked if I would go and lead the business because Ladbrokes and Sky had a joint venture actually in 2001 for red button betting on an exclusive basis. And I would have been the COO of the partnership business. That fell through partly because Ladbrokes, which was owned by Hilton was facing real tough times because of September the 11th happening in 2001. And the hotel businesses were facing massive downside and recession times. So having achieved its aim of staying in the FTSE 100 at the time, which was part of the reason for announcing the deal with Sky, they actually withdrew from that. Anyway, Sky needed someone to lead up their business. They bought these internet businesses, including Planet Football and others, in 2000, and most of the assets had gone pop in terms of their valuation after the dot-com bubble burst back then, and the only hope they had was for the betting business, so they wanted someone to come in there and lead that. Most of my job in those first 4 or 5 years was building out product again, taking it from being telephone betting and a little bit of internet betting to being available on multi-channels, including the red button on Sky Interactive, but really building out casino, poker, and some live channels that we ran then. So a lot of the work was on that. And meanwhile, the trading teams were learning about how to trade use sharp bettors on the internet and failing for a long time in a lot of businesses. I think the other thing that I learned, which emerged really through SkyBet, was we did a lot of research into who our customers were, who we were encouraging And we had a great advantage there in that there was a 7 million at the time in sort of 2004, 2005, 7 million customer base subscribers to Sky.
Yeah.
Many of whom were subscribing because of the sport. And therefore there was a natural potential route for attracting those customers and asking them to spend and develop their betting, if you like, with SkyBet. We did some consumer research, and the gambling app came in 2000, announced in 2005 and was coming in 2007. You weren't allowed to advertise until 2007 on the TV, but you could do break bumpers, the sponsorship credits that come either side of a commercial break on the TV. So we had started to sponsor break bumpers on Sky Sports to try and attract people. And we came up with, the advertising agency under a brief came up with this phrase that I know a lot of people in betting hate, but it worked. It matters more when there's money on it.
Yeah.
We saw a real tremendous growth coming through of Sky Sports consumers who were interested in sport, had more and more sport to watch and wanted a little flutter. And it matters more when there's money on it. The original line actually was, it doesn't matter unless there's money on it. But you can imagine that didn't go down too well with Sky's marketing team. So we adapted it, given that they've got, so many hundreds of matches and events, some of which not a lot of people care about unless they've got a bet on. And that was our insight.
Yeah.
But we weren't really allowed to put it across like that. So that really got us going. And for the first time, not just a recreational customer betting on horses in betting shops. Here you had recreational customers who wanted an interest in sport, who wanted a way to add to their enjoyment of sport in a non-threatening way. And that was the biggest thing I saw emerge between 2000 and 2010. The size of that market is incredible. And we built channels for them. We built this thing called SkyBet Live, where you could watch the live Sky matches, certainly the high-profile ones, and there'd be this overlay with latest in-play bets coming through that we would highlight, and a bespoke commentary done by Dale Tempest and others, where, yes, they're talking about the match, but they're also talking about what might happen next, where they weren't quite saying where the value might be. They were saying where the next SkyBet offer might be coming from and how you might take advantage of it. And, just to see things like that, I think I saw, wow, this is snowballing. This is sports betting is going to be massive. And then, of course, opportunities around the world. And as we're now seeing in North America, massive opportunities for betting operators to grow their businesses as that same relationship between sport and betting is facilitated through legalized betting in the US and Canada.
Yeah, no, that's right. You look at some of the big American sports like an NBA or some of these sports where they're trying to develop those relationships now. And just going back to what you said at Sky, I remember watching Sky Sports and Gillette Soccer Saturday, and that synergy between obviously the sport and the betting. But then if you look at it currently, it's gone the other way. We'll talk about probably a bit more about horse racing, the BHA or work there. But if you look at horse racing, and they've just released a video promoting the sport, there's no reference to betting within that. And, there's almost become a dirty word, isn't it? Like betting. And we don't really want to talk about betting, even though it's central to a sport like horse racing. I'm curious how you see that these days, and if you think that it's gone too far in terms of we can't have anything to do with betting, and that obviously needs to change a little bit, especially when it's so close to the sport like racing.
It's very worrying, I think. I suppose I can say this because I was, it might sound like after timing or sour grapes because I was over in horse racing from 2015, but I don't think the UK-based betting industry played its hand very well over the whole FOBT debate. When I was in my final year at Ladbrokes, a colleague I valued greatly back then and I worked on the impact of making changes to FOBTs, the staking levels, the limits, the time of play, and so on. John Pettit was my colleague, and he did a load of work which basically simulated what would happen in certain scenarios. Back then, you could lose up to £100 a spin on roulette at the time, and there was no limit as to what you could lose within an hour and so on, other than just the physical limits of time and any intervention that may have happened from staff with the early adoption of supportive problem gambling solutions.
Yeah.
But we looked at it and we analysed it and we basically said, well, if you reduce the maximum stake to £20 and you make it 2.5 seconds per spin on the slots on there, you actually, using the measures the Gambling Commission and others were using at the time in terms of harm, we estimated that you'd reduce harm by about 97% of those affected by FOBTs. You would maintain 98% of your profitability. because the vast, vast majority of shops had very few players playing above £20. It was mostly in and around London, where there was a lot of money going around. There was a bit of money laundering probably going on as well.
Yeah.
And there was a simple solution which would have gone down very well politically, because we would have been able to say to Tracy Crouch, the minister at the time, look, you'll be able to announce a 5-fold cut in the maximum total stake on these machines. And you can do that, and yet you'll preserve all the jobs and the businesses along with it, whilst reducing harm significantly. And this was the way the industry could have played it and probably should have played it. But even 2 years later, 3 years later, as it was coming to the end of the consultation on all of that, they were sending out surveys to their betting shop customers who'd signed up to Save Our Betting Shops, saying, with the first question saying, do you think that there should be a cut to the £100 stake? If not, please, advise your MP and use the following link for the petition. I mean, just complete madness trying to hold on to that when the tide of public opinion had completely gone against it. So I don't think that's helped. And I think that the industry is still suffering because of that.
Yeah, agreed.
You've seen organizations grow up like Gambling with Lives that highlight what they say are gambling-related suicides. And of course, it's very, very difficult for politicians and the public when they hear apparent facts unchallenged around suicides to have anything other than sympathy, of course, but a reaction suggesting that perhaps the industry isn't a very good thing and betting and gambling isn't a very healthy thing and perhaps it needs reining in. Because the industry had, I think, cried wolf a lot about this £100 on FOBTs, it wasn't in a very strong position to push back and say, well, look, actually, there are many causes involved in a suicide. That here's the evidence that suggests that. And whilst we've got total sympathy, please can we have a realistic debate about what's actually going on so that we can actually try and help the people who are at risk rather than banding around a set of numbers for political reasons. But it didn't have a leg to stand on. It's a bit like the Conservative Party over here at the moment talking about the economic policies of the current government. No one's really listening to them because of the way they acted previously. And I think there's a bit of that with the gambling industry still coming back from that. So it's very worrying times, I think.
Yeah, but especially when it comes to, let's talk about racing, because obviously you were chief executive of BHA, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that relationship there especially hasn't been smooth, and obviously things like the FOBT debate, and then we'll obviously talk about things like VIP programs and some of the ways that bookmakers operated and the pushback to it.
This podcast is sponsored by the Matchbook betting exchange. When it comes to betting exchanges, Matchbook has been my personal go-to for some time now. Using horse racing as an example, they've offered the best prices on the most runners this year, which can make a big difference to your bottom line. Plus, with an industry-leading score of 4.2 on Trustpilot, you know you're in safe hands. Download the Matchbook Betting Exchange app or go to matchbook.com today. And if you enter the code SBC150, that's SBC150 on sign up, you can get commission-free for your first 150 days, which can give you even more value. If you need to place a larger or more bespoke bet, or are indeed a corporate or operator client, their brokerage service is excellent and available 365 days a year. For more details, email the team at brokerage@matchbook.com. Matchbook Betting Exchange is for bettors who know better.
What was your relationship like during your tenure, and how do you see it now between racing and betting, especially now with the tension around affordability limits and its impact? There's lots of news at the moment as we speak and probably develop in coming weeks. I'm curious of your position and thoughts on that currently.
Relationships were good overall when I was in the BHA, reason being the betting operators who we had to deal with on Levy and other matters, other commercial matters, knew that, I understood the business, I understood them. So that was constructive. However, we did pursue levy reform and a levy increase at the time. And I was part of a small team that really pushed authorized betting partners, where we said to betting operators, unless you pay levy on bets that you're taking offshore through Gibraltar or other hubs where you're operating your digital businesses, where they were not needing to by law pay levy, unless you pay levy from there, we're going to cut off your access to British racing. You won't be able to sponsor, you won't be able to bring customers along, you won't be able to take hospitality, you won't be able to, use an association with the sport. And that was interesting because it horrified a number of people in racing who actually for years had sort of said, these bloody bookmakers should be paying more. And then when we launched this, Nick, do you really think that won't we just lose lots of money here? Won't we just finish everything? And I said, well, at the time, in 2015, it was still the case that a customer who bet on racing was more valuable than a customer who did not bet on racing to a bookmaker. So whilst they cried wolf a bit and said, well, we don't make much money out of racing, and whilst that might have been true with all the costs associated with it, that didn't take into account the benefit that they received by trading customers across other products and services. So kind of called their bluff, and some bookmakers signed up and I think got the benefit of it, and others didn't. But in the end, we were able to go to government and say, you wanted us to do a voluntary agreement. We've tried to do one. Less than half of the major bookmakers have signed up. You now need to change the levy, please. And they did. So we got a big change in the levy. So that was the context of the relationship. It was a good one in many respects, but we wanted more money from them for our product at the time. I think looking at it now, I do think that there's a tension between, if you like, the Racing Post in the UK and others speaking for racing and betting, where they're linking up fairly closely on affordability checks, so-called affordability checks and other aspects of regulation. I do think that racing needs to look at betting a little bit more about what the betting operators are doing and how they are operating affordability checks, because I think it's quite easy to pin the blame fully on the regulation rather than the operations of betting operators. And also the impact of racing and the cost of racing and its inefficiency, which is passed through to costs to bookmakers, meaning that in the last 2 years, they have definitely cut offers, they have reduced pricing, they have tried to increase their margins to help absorb some of the additional costs. And, for racing to simply sit there and, if you like, point the finger at the Gambling Commission and never look to itself, I think is tricky. I'm a non-executive director at Redcar Racecourse, so I'm familiar with the finances of a small racecourse. The dynamics of the British racing industry mean that there is a kind of historical entitlement to fixtures and the funding from the levy board and associated media rights money that goes with those fixtures, irrespective of A, the overall health of the sport, and B, the contribution that those individual fixtures make. We got 60 racecourses with an average of 25, 26 fixtures each. For the other 340 days of the year, they're sitting there. Some have got non-race day income, others have very little non-race day income. And yet we are diverting betting revenues through the levy and the media rights to continue the operations of 60 racecourses with, old stands and asbestos roofs and maintenance of ground and increasing costs of watering in given climate change and so on. And, that is not a terribly efficient way to keep putting a hand out and saying betting's got to pay more. Also, they're not challenging the betting companies about what they're doing with horse racing bettors and the decisions they're taking on those customers now. And I think that some of the regulation has meant that horse race betting is less attractive, partly because the ability to, you mentioned VIPs before, the ability to manage VIPs in a certain way has gone. The ability to cross-sell, we've seen some new regulation in the UK about whether you can cross-sell to other products from sports products. All of that means that the value of horse racing customers relative to the costs is decreasing. And racing really needs, in my opinion, I think one of your questions you sent me in advance was, if I had a magic wand, what would I do?
Yeah.
Racing really, really needs to grasp this and somehow look at its governance structure and empower a central governing body to have more power, frankly, to act on behalf of the sport. Otherwise, individual businesses, which are the racecourses, will understandably try to do the best for their individual businesses, but that will mean preserving a setup at the moment which is massively inefficient and means that the fairly decent monies that do come from the betting industry are being dispersed too widely. And if I was speaking to the betting guys, I'd say, I'd ask them to push for that, but at the same time to recognise that the best way for them to improve their lobby, apart from dealing with, making sure they're on top of looking after the welfare of those customers that they do have who are potentially at risk, is to get behind racing if it does reform, because that's the strongest place for it to be in the UK Parliament when it wants to lobby for the betting side of its business.
Oh, really interesting insight. Hopefully people from the BHA and various bookmaker operators will be listening to that, because I think it could do a lot worse than bringing you on board and listening to your experience on that one. And
I had my go, so they'll be saying, oh, well, what did he do when he was in there then?
Well, the levy for a start. I mean, obviously, I think it's such a challenging time. You need that voice of experiences like that who can come in from different backgrounds as well. Because obviously, you've done more than just you've worked in bookmaking. You've obviously worked in the BHA and we'll talk about other work as well, the Gambling Commission. But it's interesting, you've got these customers, when you mentioned earlier about the value of a customer bets on racing being so valuable in previous years, you'd have to challenge that idea these days. And many bookmakers privately will discuss, racing's such a problem these days. We can't not have it, but the way it's structured, it's a problem. And they want the customers, and they like the fact there's a race every 5 minutes, and there's so many races every day. It's pretty much every day there's always plenty of racing, and it's one of those great turnover sports. But if you look at Cheltenham this year, which is obviously the flagship event, less offers as a bettor and a bookmaker, it doesn't seem to be quite the focal point and not the wonderful period that it should be. And you can see the impact on racing and racing betting through festivals like that, I think. Let me ask you then about your work at the Gambling Commission, because they are, as you mentioned, they are the focus of everyone's ire very much these days, whether it be the Racing Post or various other organisations. And you are the chair of their industry forum. What can you tell me about your time and your role there?
I joined in November 2007 when it was being set up. They have 3 other advisory groups. We became the 4th. The other 3 are Lived Experience Group, which really would be better named as Lived Experience of Gambling Harms Group. There's an advisory group for safer gambling, and there's a digital group as well, which advises the Commission on data and GDPR and, how to get the best out of its insights and so on. The advisory group for safer gambling is much more focused on education and treatment and research. It's really the academic side of looking particularly at gambling harms. The Lived Experience Group, actually, we get on really well with, which I'll return to. Their insights are very similar to our insights around the impact of, and perhaps unintended consequences of, regulatory policy. The group that I chair is made up of, I receive a fee, I'm paid for the role, I receive £12,000 a year for chairing it, and I do a couple of days a month for that. Works out a bit more normally, but it's enjoyable in many ways. And then there are currently 10 other people who sit on the group, all of whom work in the industry. Some have backgrounds as operators, some are games providers, some are, I suppose, marketeers or compliance people as well. And I was involved in interviewing them and selecting them when we started off. And we've got a good mix of those who are capable of looking at the big picture, but also they're close enough to the operational detail to be able to help the Commission with specifics. Our role is to provide advice. We are, when I was first announced, a lot of the industry kind of came to me and said, you've got to get the Commission to do this and that and the other. And I said, well, that's the role of the trade bodies and you guys lobbying. Our role is to provide advice to the Commission. We're trying to help them. Of course, the two should not be detached, but I'm not going in there lobbying for you. You need to do that yourself. We can keep up communication to help ensure that the efforts are most effective. We sit once about 8 times a year. So far we've sat. We have a balanced agenda of 50% of topics that the Commission's executive suggests and 50% that we suggest. And we've covered all sorts of things, but particularly recently we've covered financial checks. We've covered the black market, unregulated market. We've covered an area which I think is really important and which the Commission is trying to get on top of and probably hasn't done much work on, which is fair and open. In other words, how you can make sure that consumers have a fair and open approach. They've spent a lot of time on smacking operators over their heads for failings on money laundering and problem gambling and so on. And they've spent a lot of time looking at various other aspects of regulation, but they haven't really focused on the consumer as much as they'd like to. And I think it's really good that they are. So we've spent quite a bit of time on that with them lately. And it's an interesting dynamic in the room because you've got a series of operators who are actually advocating on behalf of consumers. So I think there is a gap at the Commission where they might think about having a consumer group rather than simply a lived experience of gambling harms consumer group. But we try to do our best with that hat on. It might seem like a conflict, but I'm interested in making sure that consumers get the best out of things. So a lot of time spent around that stuff, but we're on hand to provide advice. And we've spent the last year and a half trying to encourage the Commission's executives not to think that this is another lynching from a trade body that's going to have a moan at them, but this is a group of people who are willing to help. Anything that they brief us in the room stays in the room. I think we've been good to our word on that. Nothing's come out that shouldn't have done, and we've seen a lot of stuff ahead of time, and we try to help them to get their regulation policy right. That's our role.
Because a lot of people listening to this who do bet will think that the Gambling Commission don't have any interest or don't represent them because they're, like I say, they're focused on other topics and other concerns. We regularly here at SBC, we published a guide talking about bookmaker disputes and how to handle it, whether it be the ADRs or whether it be dealing with bookmakers directly. And there seems to be an increase anecdotally, but also you'll have seen this across whether it be social media and other areas, no doubt, an increase in friction and problems with operators. And that's just one particular topic. People would talk about restrictions, the increase in their application to various people, whether they just be not actually winning bettors, but people betting maybe on sports or markets that bookmakers just don't want. Do you think there's much appetite at the Commission, or do you think that needs to be looked at when it comes to how they understand the consumer? You referenced it there. Are you seeing that growing from their perspective, or is there still some resistance?
Yeah, I think they're getting there. And I think the chief exec is particularly keen to make progress on this. Andrew Rhodes, I think he's a bit fed up of operators telling customers that, this is a regulatory requirement that we're asking you for X, Y, and Z, when oftentimes that's not necessarily the case. To be fair to operators, I'll do a very quick bit. We had a good session on anti-money laundering at the forum recently, where the lead guy at the Commission came along and he spoke to the operators around the table and said that, why are you asking for documents all the time? Because, we don't want you asking for documents. It's meant to be a risk-based approach. You're meant to be using a judgment. And the conversation progressed quite helpfully, where three of the guys in the room had quite a lot of recent experience in managing a compliance audit from the Commission, where the lead guys, troops on the ground, were asking the operators on every case they looked at, and which documents did you ask for? And why didn't you ask for documents? So the reality of where the Commission perhaps thinks it is on AML versus what's happening in its interactions with operators might be slightly out of kilter, and is in a situation where massive fines are being issued, where individuals who work in these organizations can have their livelihoods taken away if they lose their personal license. It'd be quite understandable if you're being asked at a compliance assessment why you haven't asked for documents in pretty much every case that the assessment is examining. Why? It's pretty obvious that you're going to ask. If in doubt, you're going to ask. And I think that's been manifesting itself for a few years now. I think that kind of insight can help the Commission to get its regulation right. The other side of things, on fair and open, again, the chief executive is very keen to make sure that certain practices that perhaps have been embedded over the years, but which are not very transparent for consumers, are addressed. And I genuinely think they want to and are attempting to make good progress on that. You mentioned restrictions. I know that they have carried out an exercise recently on a request for information from quite a number of operators with UK licenses about restrictions, when they've happened, why they've happened, how many products affected, what stake levels affected, how many bets have been placed, for example, when the interaction took place, what the triggers were, what documentation is kept, and so on. And I understand that the information is going to be published at some point. I understand that the operators have been quite cooperative. I haven't seen the findings, but I understand from the conversation I had the other day that the findings are really quite interesting based on one or two things that were said to me. So I think that's something to look out for. And I think that will show the Commission's commitment to start to get under the skin of some of this stuff. I think a basic, like, if you are restricted in some way, or if you are cut short in some way, even the basic communication around it might be quite useful. I spent in my own betting. I was having a bet with an operator who should remain nameless, trying to put a bet on something one day, and I kept getting this stake too high, and I thought, well, there must be some kind of error here, because I was asking for £10, then I asked for £5, then I asked for £1, and then I thought, well, I'll try a penny. Oh no, there must be something wrong here. How naive am I? Anyway, I thought, well, I'll contact their customer services team and see if there's a general issue. It took 4 hours waiting on chat, trying to master all of the various chatbot stuff to get to a real person to talk about this. 4 hours in 2 goes to get there, and I was told, oh, well, you've been stake factored.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks for telling me. Just basics. No, that might not change the fate for a lot of people, but it saves you 4 hours. Just the basic communication, decision-making rationale, the records that are being kept, and the fairness and transparency of it. And I think they will also look at, I think this is a difficult one to examine, but I think they will look at pricing as well. So if you say that you're offering 4 to 1, what does that mean? I don't think we will get to a guaranteed bet or anything like that, but I do think that there may have to be more information about what is the record for this operator in terms of meeting a price request, shall we say. It's a bit nebulous at the moment. I think that whole area needs examining.
Yeah, well, it goes to advertising as well, doesn't it? People have referenced the fact that it can be misleading if they are. You see some bookmakers talk about, in terms of advertising, talk about, working out the problem, beating the bookmaker. I think one operator at the moment who've got an advertising campaign based upon that. But yet you think, well, actually, I can't. If I do that, then I'm not going to get a bet on at the odds that you're quoting me, and nobody will. If they're consistently good. So I think it's really encouraging to hear that, because obviously there was a series of questions I had for you, either in terms of the appetite and what may transpire from that. And it's encouraging to hear the Gambling Commission are looking into it. And you referenced before about waving a wand. This was the question, what would you change if you were in charge of the current regulatory approach to make it fairer for both consumers and operators?
Right now, we need a consumer ombudsman. It's been talked about. It needs to happen. So if you go to, I know consumers don't have a lot of confidence sometimes in the likes of IBAS. I know the chief executive of IBAS, and he's a man of very good integrity, but he tears his hair out at times because he'll make a decision or one of his team will make a decision on a case they'll find in favor of the operator. But he has had to go by that because their terms and conditions were clearly stated, if not very obviously clear to everyone when placing their bets, clearly stated. And therefore he needs to go with it. The fact that he may think that the terms and conditions are pretty unfair, he has no power to deal with that. He can only make a decision within what the stated terms and conditions are. An ombudsman can do something very different in that case and can start to enforce changes around unfair terms and conditions and, mirror those back into the regulation, if you like, the Gambling Commission lead. So I think that needs to happen. And I'm worried that it might be slipping away at the moment as time goes on. Obviously, the new government's got plenty of other things it wants to lead up with. I think there needs to perhaps be an understanding of the implication of the realities of the financial checks and their unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I think the industry cried wolf a lot 2 to 3 years ago about black market. I don't think it's crying wolf now. I think that the numbers are catching up with the rhetoric. And I worry that people who genuinely are vulnerable are going into the wrong hands where they have no protections. I opened by way of research, you'll understand, I opened an offshore site, a crypto site the other day, absolutely zero KYC, just an email address, which obviously may or may not contain your name, and a sort of email confirmation and obviously a unique deposit reference with regards to the crypto deposit. But, no interest, no mention of problem gambling, no interest in it whatsoever. They just want to, understandably, I get it, let people bet. Now, if the regulation goes too far here, and if, for example, there is no route for these people who are at risk, at harm, then they may end up in the wrong hands. And along the way, that regulation catches a whole series of other people. The £150 soft check now, if it was brought in betting shops, would affect someone who goes in every day, perhaps as their hobby, and has a 50p lucky 15, 2 months out of 12, unless they're super duper clever at it. If they're an average punter, 2 months out of 12, they may well breach the £150 loss. And I'm not saying that it's right that some people may not be able to afford a £150 loss. I get that. I'm not belittling that. But it shows the scale of people that could get caught in this unintendedly. And your listeners will know, and you will know yourself, if you bet with UK licensed bookmakers, if there's any change in your betting activity in any week, you are getting problem gambling emails. Are you okay? It's our duty to do X, Y, and Z. And I just worry that we've gone away from a proper risk-based approach to a lowest common denominator approach. So I would want to amend that. And I think there are ways to do that. And it should, reflect a true understanding of the gambling industry. The other day I was speaking to someone about my own betting stuff, and I said it's a bit like regulating jockeys at the BHA. On the one hand, they must achieve the best possible finish. That's one of the key rules of racing. Your jockey's got to try and get the best placing he can. At the same time, you must, at the first sign of distress of your horse, make sure that you take effective action to protect the health of the horse and pull the horse up. Now, the window over the years between achieving the best possible position and looking after the horse has narrowed, and the window between making sure that you can deposit and have a bet and manage it profitably in some way from time to time has narrowed again. I had a situation the other day. Again, I think it's an unintended consequence with an operator where I've never withdrawn. I happened to be ahead with that operator. I was about £4,000 up, and then I hit a low point on two of the products that I bet on with them and dropped £1,000 in a month. And I wasn't able to bet for the rest of that month because they have put on a £1,000 loss limit for me as a customer, which they've never reviewed, won't deal with. So I can't have a bet.
Yeah.
And I just think that just common sense has gone out of the window there. I wasn't looking to bet the other £3,000. I wanted a 50 quid bet on. So understanding the dynamics of all of those points, we need to continue to help the Commission to do that.
Yeah, speaking my language and many people's language who are listening to this there, Nick, and I think that common sense approach rather than what we have at the moment would help everybody, whether it be people like you and I who like to bet or people who are vulnerable, who have no protections. And I've seen that, you can open these accounts, deposit, and nobody's checking. And obviously you get some nefarious operators who are targeting people who are vulnerable. And it's a very tricky environment to protect them because just the nature of the internet these days, and the way money can move, and the way people can be targeted through online messaging, and even things like Telegram. Which is an increase in usage from a betting perspective. You can just bet through Telegram, and some of their operators and ways and means that happens. It must be very, very difficult from a regulatory or protection viewpoint to kind of oversee that and protect people. Well, we've got a chance, Nick. I want to ask you a little bit about your own betting. We talked about that at different points throughout the podcast, but that's how I got to know you. We've exchanged several emails and a call over the past year. We obviously talked about topics that we've discussed here, but also you are an SBC member and you're undergoing your own quest to make a profit from your betting. From what I know, it's going quite well, but what dare you reveal or share on this podcast in terms of your betting quest and why you're doing it?
I mean, I've always enjoyed betting, as I mentioned earlier, and I would be your archetypal recreational punter. I've been lucky because I've had a career where I've earned reasonably well. Well, very well. I've earned very well over the years, so I haven't had to worry too much if I lose quite extensively betting. And over the years, I lost quite extensively betting. But I always had this mix of an element of systematic betting, particularly on horses, and other stuff. And I think a lot of recreational players are a bit like that as well. They'll have something that they really focus on, and other areas they don't. So I've always loved it. A couple of times I've dabbled with saying, could I actually make a couple of quid out of this? Not for the money, for the intellectual stimulus. And I was on garden leave between jobs a couple of times and tried my best on the horses through Betfair and other routes, and struggled to overcome the commission, shall we say, but not too bad. I do three main things, I suppose, and it's all about keeping my brain active, I suppose, alongside everything else that I'm doing. And I really enjoy it. Three things. I've got my own work, and there I do some horse racing systems that I research myself and follow over a period of time. And most of those are set up to work with Matchbook through MB Bot Manager I use to automate that. Many of the bets are placed near the off. And then I do quite a bit of work around politics, entertainment, and so on. So Eurovision was a big week last week for me, just off my own analysis and thoughts. And also my other half, Tanya's pretty good on the Eurovision, so she helped me a lot with that. So there's some of my own stuff, and then I use a series of tools when I have time. I can take these or leave these. Bookie bashing, I think, is first class, and I enjoy using that. And some of the intellectual challenge of some of the bets that are set up with in-game specials and trying to work them out is tremendous. I use Outplayed a bit for some of my horse racing stuff, and I use Gold Profits as well for a bit of football trading, just getting going with that one. And then I've got a lot of services that I also use, many of which have come through being a member of Smart Betting Club, enjoying those. And I added winner odds tennis as well. I added after last year's Smart Bash. I was impressed with the guys there and got going with that. And that's a tremendous product if you've got enough road to run into. And being a recreational customer with lots of accounts that were no good, perhaps I've had a bit more road to run with than many others have.
Absolutely.
I could be at this all day, but, I need a life too. So I tend to have a bit of a core routine. There's certain things that will be in every day. I'll do them in the morning before I get going, and in the evening, depending on what the issue is. And then the rest of the time, if I've got time, I'll just respond to alerts. And it's been great because I've learned so much. Telegram, I never used that before this. I'm using AI a little bit, not to help with working out the EV, but just to help me with some of the technology, setting up the automation from various spreadsheets and feeding it into various programs with Visual Basic that I'd never used before. And then, of course, the world of VPNs that was quite scary for me when I thought about it. And then I tried it and thought, what was all the fuss about here? So I've learned a lot, and I feel like at age 57 that, some of these things I should have known already, but it's been great. And it's been great to have an insight into all of this so that I can really understand, I suppose, the sharper bettors a bit more. I'm not pretending that I'm either one of them or up to speed with all of you guys listening, but it's been really useful to understand the thought processes you go through, and then some of the experiences with the operators that you hit as well, which are very mixed, shall we say, and how you manage your relationship with your operator and the betting profile that you create and so on. And of course, this will come to an end at some point, Pete, because what I won't do is cross the line and do multi-accounting or anything like that. So I always want to stay on the right side of the law or the regulation or whatever it may be. But, it's great fun. I'm enjoying it. I'm making a few quid, but really it's the intellectual challenge.
It is. It's intellectual. It challenges, obviously, your coordination of it, like making something work and getting the bets on, but also things like bankroll management, dealing with the psychology, because it's not a straight line, the route to making a profit. So it challenges you from that psychological perspective too. And it's great, I think, to hear someone like yourself with such a track record in industry, working on all sides of the betting world and the sporting world, doing something like this, especially when you're representing or on panels where you ostensibly could be representing people who bet. And it's great to know that some of the names you mentioned there, the services, many that I have used or recommended through the service. So it's really encouraging to hear that, Nick. And thank you very much for sharing. And I've kept you a good hour now. Obviously, I think we could talk for a lot longer, but thank you very much for your time today, Nick. And
thank you.
So what's the plans moving forward? Is it continue with the betting? Obviously, that might have a limited shelf life. And obviously, you talked about some of the other work you're doing.
Yeah, I've got various non-exec roles. I'm a charity trustee at the Injured Jockeys Fund, amongst other things, and I do some consulting works on equestrian, racing governance and so on. We've done some work around the world, which is good fun. And I revisited my degree, so I'm studying a degree at Open University. So I just wish I didn't have to sleep, to be honest. That would be quite helpful.
Those 6 to 7 hours or so a night. Yeah, it's very problematic.
Indeed.
Well, Nick, thank you ever so much for coming on. I think you shared so much insight today. And we'll be seeing you at Smart Bash, won't we, in July the 4th. You're going to be part of a panel where we're going to talk about some of the issues that we got in today, especially like regulation and problems, disputes, and many other things. So if people want to hear more and see you, you'll be able to do so on the 4th of July. So thank you ever so much for your time today, Nick. And I look forward to meeting you next month.
See you then. Thanks very much.